On today's show, the Houston Rockets feel like they're experiencing a culture and identity crisis. Plus, what needs to improve with their late game execution? It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What is up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, the #1 sports podcast network. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets. On today's show, we're going to be getting into a bit of this dilemma that this Houston Rockets team is facing, a lack of the culture that Ime Udoka established these first 2 years here in Houston, kind of an identity crisis that this squad is dealing with right now, as well as the crunch time execution problems, the inability to close out games at the end. We're going to get into all of that on today's show. First, we'll let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Before tip-off, check the FanDuel app and see what's dropping during NBA Happy Hour every Friday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being one of our amazing everydayers. And joining us now is your weekly co-host, the Podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Rockets Launch Pod, Ben DuBose. You can track down on Blue Sky at Ben DuBose. Here to maybe try and diagnose what's wrong with this Rockets team, a team that has seemingly forgotten how to play crunch time basketball, a team that might be going through some semblance of a culture or maybe an identity crisis a little bit at this stage of the season. Ben, outside of watching Rockets basketball as of late, how are you doing, man?
Doing well, ready for the holidays. So I would be in a better mood if not for the Rockets, but I mean, hopefully the Rockets play better against the Clippers and especially the Lakers and get us back to the good vibes we had. You know, it's crazy. The Rockets have had 2 awful losses in the past 4 days, and yet they had probably their best win of the season sandwiched in between them. So I think it's sort of a swing of emotions, but hopefully the games in LA, they'll definitely be spotlight games, national TV. Hopefully that gives us the Denver Rockets and not the Sacramento Rockets.
Yeah, it's definitely been a little bit of a roller coaster following this team, covering this team, the emotional turmoil of this team. And unfortunately, when you follow up a big win like the Nuggets win with such just a disappointing loss like that against the Kings, it doesn't quite erase the Nuggets game, but it takes a lot of the wind out of your sails where you're like, oh, okay, you think you're building towards something, and then you turn right back around and lay an egg the same way you did, or in a similar fashion as to the Pelicans game. Maybe not quite as bad, but still pretty egregious. Ben, it's so hard to try and figure out where to even start with this team, but I do get the feeling just watching this team, right? I'm not reaching and saying like, oh my God, they're broken. There's locker room issues and guys hate each other. Nothing like that. But no, this team fundamentally feels different than last year in the sense that last year we at least knew what the team's identity was, right? We knew that they were going to be a gritty, hard-nosed, defense-first mentality, grinded out some games, with final score, 92-90, like the, Ime Udoka staple kind of team. And it feels like this team has lost that defensive edge while also simultaneously still trying to find itself offensively. And I don't know how much of that is just because of the roster turnover and missing key pieces, like no more Dillon Brooks as kind of a culture setter, not having Fred VanVleet out there, but this team just feels a little lost at this point. And it's like they're trying to find themselves through this season.
And look, let's reset. They're 9 games into December and they're 4-5. So I'm done making excuses. The first week of the year, the first week of the month, it was a little underwhelming, but the 2 losses to Utah and Dallas, night 2 of back-to-backs, they were shorthanded. They had a sluggish performance for 3 quarters against the Kings at home, but 5 games in 7 nights, we threw out the excuses. And then after everything that happened in the first Denver game last week, to lay the egg off of 2 days of rest in New Orleans, blowing a 25-point lead, yeah, that's not the back-to-back. That's not having Steven Adams. That's some fundamental issues. And then to see it happen again in Sacramento, I know it was night 2 of a back-to-back, but spoiler, it was for the Kings as well. And so to see it continue to happen, regardless of rest, regardless of who's available, regardless of back-to-backs. You had Tari Eason as reinforcement against the Kings. I'm done making excuses. I'm done saying that, well, this is just a quirky schedule and it'll be fine with more time. It may be fine with more time, but they've got to address some real issues that are not simply just bad luck, bad scheduling, whatever you want to attribute it to. And I just think that, it would be perfect if there was a one-size-fits-all solution in terms of like one thing they could tactically change or one trade they could make or rotation change they could make. But the slippage has been across the board. The last 5 games, the Rockets are number 26 in the NBA in defensive rating, one of the 5 worst teams. For the month of December overall, which is nearly 10 games in length, they are number 15, so middle of the pack. This was a team that was number 2 defensively through October and November when they were 13-4 and had that dominant net rating, looked like the second best team in the West behind OKC. So the slippage is not just crunch time offense or just 1 or 2 players. No, it's across the board. And I think in terms of diagnosing what's going wrong, listen to their alphas, listen to their leaders. Ime Udoka, post-game in Sacramento, multiple times called out the motivation, said he needs to get better at motivating those guys. Kevin Durant said they let their foot off the gas. When you see the slippage across the board, I'm inclined to think that it's not all these different areas that different things are going wrong, but I think it's more there's slippage everywhere because there's a lack of motivation, because they're going through it. And I think, some of it, teams need to learn to handle success. Like the Rockets had nothing but positive praise for months, really, ever since the Kevin Durant trade at the end of June. So they got off to the fast start. They had all this talk. They were the team of the offseason. And it just looks to me by the eye test, and I think Ime Udoka and Kevin Durant, as the leaders, the alphas, are seeing it as well, that perhaps it was coming too easily for those guys. Defensively, that's where you're seeing a lot of slippage. But I also think, crunch time offense, there can be a tendency to lean a bit too heavily on the big guns, Kevin Durant, Alperen Sengun, and trust them to bail you out. Just if you're one of those other 3 players, say, as long as I don't mess it up, as long as I get the ball to Kevin or Alpi, they'll figure it out and we should be fine. And unlike last year where they sort of knew their limitations and they always played hard, this year, I think so much of their identity became about those 2 all-stars and that star level potential that the team didn't have a year ago. Maybe some of the foundation has been eroded of that 52-30 number 2 seed in the West. Like, I don't want to pin it all on the players that are out there because they did lose 3 starters. There's no Dillon Brooks. There's no Fred VanVleet. There's no Jalen Green, who I think was underappreciated in terms of defense and hustle. But I also think just overall, Ime and KD are saying what they are saying for a reason. This is not the same team, at least not right now, that it was a year ago. And you don't need to panic. They were 13-4 through November, so they can easily recapture that. What we saw in Denver, it's not, that they can't get back to that. And hopefully they will against the Clippers and the Lakers. But the issues are real and they're deeper than just, 1 or 2 little tweaks.
And to your point about this, it's very much felt like what you were alluding to, right? The whole, guys at times feel like I don't want to say starstruck with the Rockets, like talking about the teammates, right? But there is like this weird level of them trying to figure out how to play through Kevin Durant, right? How to play alongside a superstar, how to play alongside Alperen Sengun, who's elevated himself into the All-NBA conversation, and figuring out the general kind of give and take of, hey, okay, on these possessions, okay, we're going through this guy. On these possessions, okay, this is what the defense is doing, and they're going to try and take away one of these 2 guys. So how do we react accordingly? And I do think that, unfortunately, at least for me, and this is just my perspective, we're going to dive into some of the X's and O's and some of what we've seen on the court, some of the issues with the late game execution and the crunch time issues and all that stuff. But I also I've been less than impressed with kind of the just overall approach to how the 2 stars have been deployed at this stage in the season. Like, I remember coming into the year basically laying the claim that, this year is going to tell us a lot about what Ime Udoka is capable of as an offensive coach, right? Like, what does he have at his disposal? What can he accomplish with 2 hyper talented offensive stars in Kevin Durant and Alperen Sengun? And unfortunately, the tendency for this team to just kind of slip into that, like, hey, like, just give it to one of the stars and they'll take care of it, or the really stagnant, like, isolation plays at the end of games, those I can't help it, but that has to go back to, in some capacity, it falls on coaching. You're not just going to be able to blame the 5 guys on the floor. Like, there's got to be a level of Ime kind of throwing his weight around and calling a set, having some influence over what's actually happening on the floor at the end of some of these games, instead of just, hey, dump it into Alp, give it to KD, let them figure it out. And that puts the pressure on him to see how he can better utilize his 2-star players and the supporting cast around those guys, which is something we're going to get into in further detail here. We're going to talk about the actual specific X's and O's, some of the issues that we've seen in these late game collapses against the Pelicans, against the Kings, some of the struggles before either of those 2 games even came on the radar. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL Sundays move fast, one big play, and suddenly everything feels different. That's what makes live betting with FanDuel so exciting. You're not just watching the game, you're reacting to it in real time. With FanDuel, you can place bets as the action actually unfolds. Every drive, every momentum swing, every highlight moment. Live betting is best when the game starts to shift, a receiver gets hot, a defense tightens up, or the momentum flips after a turnover. FanDuel lets you jump into the moment with live spreads and money lines that adjust instantly, player props that update as different guys heat up. You can bet on next touchdown scores, drive results, totals, and so much more. It keeps you locked into every snap, every drive, every single possibility. So if you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, visit FanDuel.com and place your NFL live bets all season long. FanDuel, the game moves fast, and so can you. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Remember, the best way to help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. The comments help us out a ton. We want your help diagnosing what's wrong with this Rockets team. Let us know in the YouTube comments. All right, Ben, now looking at this team and trying to kind of piece together, trying to figure out where some of the major problems have been. We talked about a little bit of kind of the culture, the identity crisis that this team is kind of facing, and some of the kind of the confluence of factors, all at play as to what's going on with this team right now, while they're trying to figure things out. But we also have actual film to go off of, right? We've seen these collapses happen in real time against the Pelicans, against the Kings. What are you seeing when you're watching this team really struggle at the end of these games, trying to put away, just not even thinking about back to the season opener and trying to put away the Thunder, right? We're talking about just trying to put away bad teams right now, and they're not able to even do that at a high level right now.
I think they desperately need a third creator offensively to step up, ideally a consistent one, so that you can build reps and not have to go back and forth depending on the game. And then defensively, they need to be better across the board. The effort just needs to be better. It's that simple. But I really do think some of this is players underperforming, and a lot of it, quite frankly, is Amen Thompson. He's not having a bad season, but this is not the breakthrough that I think a lot of us, including you and me, Jackson, thought that it would be a couple of months ago. And I think it especially shows in the clutch. And he's just 22 years old. He's just year 3. There's plenty of time for this to improve, but it's very different than the formula a year ago, and that's why I'm inclined to, at least for now, give Ime Udoka the benefit of the doubt. Look, that team last year, because they knew their limitations, we always preached about how sometimes you, sometimes me, always us was limited in terms of the high-end upside, maybe, but it also gave you a high floor in that they knew they had to be connected and play together to have a chance, because they did have limitations. Well, this year, I think those other guys, and most notably Amen Thompson, are a little too and Alperen Sengun, to the point where they're not taking advantage of the mismatches that are created. And there's one play at the end of the Kings game that drove me crazy, and I sent you the screenshot, Jackson. About 30 seconds left, when the Rockets were still up 3 and they were looking for that bucket to put the game away. And KD waited at half court for the double team to come, which, you can question that strategy if you want, but it does create an advantage 4-on-3 on the backside. And I'm not going to say it's a strategy without merit. I think back to the 2019 to 2020 season, the Rockets did that with James Harden coming off the Unguardable tour a lot, and it worked fairly well. It took a little bit of time for Russ to get his feet underneath them with the Rocket system, and then they swapped out Clint Capela for Robert Covington. But when they had the spacing right and Russ was comfortable, that late game offense looked really good. And I think it's a variation of what you're seeing now with Kevin waiting for that double. I know there's some people that want him to act earlier, but they wanted to burn clock, and they got a 4-on-3. And this is just one pass, but I mentioned this sequence because I think it speaks to the cultural issues that we were just describing and outlining. So KD gets the double with about 8 seconds left on the shot clock. Amen flashes to the elbow. He catches the pass. He looks around the court, and he's got three options at that point. So Jabari's in the corner, and Jabari's got a defender on him. So Jabari's, the shooter from the corner / wing, and unlike Tari Eason, that defender, I'm not sure who it was, stayed home. So that was not an option. And so basically there were three things that Amen could do, because giving it back to KD with two guys on him and KD at half court, the shot clock running out, was obviously not a viable option. So Amen can go at DeMar DeRozan one-on-one, trust his footwork, his athleticism. We saw him finish on a similar drive against Derek Queen late in the Pelicans game. He could have given it to Josh Okogie, who was cutting and unguarded, in my opinion. If the pass is right, I think Okogie gets a dunk. Worst case, I think he likely gets fouled by DeMar DeRozan and goes to the line. Or there's option C, which is kick it back to Alperen Sengun 40 feet from the bucket with 4 seconds left on the shot clock. And after considering all three, because if you slow it down, you can see Amen's head turns towards Josh Okogie. He sees it. And I think on paper, he knows if he's playing to his instincts, either attacking himself or kicking it to a wide open Okogie who's cutting is the way to go. I know Okogie missed a three that could have put the game away a couple of possessions earlier, but I mean, that was not a three. That was Okogie, who's very athletic, going straight to the rim. And instead, Amen, chose the worst of the three options, clearly the worst in my opinion, which is kicking it to Şengün, basically giving him a grenade with 4 seconds left on the shot clock, being 40 feet away from the bucket, and he has to just basically put up a contested heave, which had no chance from 25 plus feet away. Jackson, that tells me Amen is not trusting what is right in front of him. He went into that sequence predetermined that either KD or Şengün was going to shoot that shot. And since it obviously wasn't going to be KD, then it was going to Şengün. And I'm sorry, like if you're gonna go under the logic of it's okay if you take KD out, which seemingly the coaching staff believes is the right play because we can execute these 4-on-3s, then you need more than one other player amongst those four to be able to create, or the 4-on-3s are going to be too difficult to stop, or too easy to stop, for the three defenders. So I just think you need a third defender or a third offensive player to attack those defenses. It's not going to be Jabari. It's not going to be Josh Okogie. Ideally, it would be Amen, but he's looked tentative. Reed Sheppard has shown promise, and I think when the Rockets look best at this deficiency, at executing late in close games, was the first Denver game, and Reed was consistently out there. The problem is that Ime, for defensive reasons, and I understand why, he's sort of going back and forth between Reed and Josh, and I think it's tough to get the consistency and the reps you need to be comfortable as that third banana if you're constantly being yanked in and out of the lineup from possession to possession potentially. So ideally it'd be Amen. It could be Reed, but if it is, I think they need to trust him more. I just think the bottom line is that there aren't enough other players beyond KD and Şengün that are confident and willing enough to attack. And if you're gonna attack those situations under the logic of, hey, we invite the double, which Kevin Durant clearly did, then you need more than one other player in those other four to be able to attack. Right now, unless Reed Sheppard's out there, the Rockets only have one.
And realistically, when you compare and contrast that to last year's team, right? Here's the thing is, even let's go back to the Golden State Warriors series, right? Where Jalen Green was the decoying. Jalen Green was the one being taken out of these plays, right? You start the play with Jalen, ball in his hands, release valve pass over the top to Alperen Sengun, catches it on the short roll. And then who are his weapons, right? He has Fred VanVleet, very capable of putting the ball on the floor, making a play, or knocking down an open shot. He has Dillon Brooks, very capable of putting the ball on the floor, making a play, getting to his mid-range, driving, straight line drive to the rim, making a play off the catch, or just knocking down an open shot. And then also Amen Thompson, who was playing last season like a much more confident and decisive version of himself. And so you had a more dynamic approach to the overall offense, whereas this year you've got role players who at times and at the wrong times are getting a little too big for their britches and overstepping out of their roles, but they're not overstepping in the times where you actually need them to attack in those 4-on-3 scenarios when either Kevin Durant or Alperen Sengun are generating those advantages. And unfortunately, I understand where the coaching staff's logic is, where it's like, okay, well, we're going to have Kevin, the ball will be in his hands. They're going to send 2 to the ball. Like, we like the 4-on-3 power play. Like, I get it in theory. I also just think it's a really miserable way to use a future first ballot Hall of Famer like Kevin Durant to just have him be out. It's disappointing, right? You want to see Kevin be the recipient of these passes, not the one initiating the offense. But that goes back to the crux of the whole issue here is the Rockets don't have that go-to initiator, because otherwise it would be Fred VanVleet initiating these plays at the end of a game, right? And you'd be running 1-3 pick and roll with Fred and KD, or 1-5 pick and roll with Fred VanVleet and Alperen Sengun, and you'd be getting those guys catching it on the short roll, and then one of them, either Şengün or KD, would be the final recipient of a pass as the defense is scrambling and trying to figure out who to do what. And this is where we get into that conversation of getting one more creator out on the floor, and it really feels like the answer, or at least the clearest possible answer here in the short term, is giving Reed Sheppard a bigger role, giving him the keys and entrusting him, because right now, Amen Thompson, unfortunately, due to his limitations, isn't really being guarded by defenses and doesn't really have the ability to run the pick and roll at a high enough level that it's actually going to create an advantage for the Rockets, unfortunately.
And to be clear, we saw this with Amen late in the New Orleans game as well. And so I know I'm making a mountain out of a molehill with one possession late in the Sacramento game, but I'm doing it because I think it's a microcosm. We heard Ryan Hollins and Craig Ackerman on the broadcast call out the indecision, and most of it was Amen Thompson late in that game when they were using KD as the decoy. And Amen had that one drive against Derek Queen that looked really good, but other than that, he had one that he didn't finish, and then from that point forward, he was tentative. He didn't want the ball in those spots. He didn't trust his willingness or ability to finish through contact at awkward angles, to make the right read. I don't know exactly what you would attribute that to. You would have to ask him, and he might not want to, publicly tell you. But the reality, I don't think the reason even matters for purposes of this discussion. He's just not doing it right now. We hope in time that he can. He's just 22 years old. But I agree with you. On paper, the guy would seem to be Reed Sheppard, but there are the obvious questions defensively. And then it also gets back to, can you ask Reed Sheppard to do that and expect the best version of Reed if he's being yanked in and out of that fourth quarter lineup? I actually asked Reed about this at the practice right before the road trip. The last time the Rockets were in Houston, I asked him if it's difficult to be, yanked in and out of the closing lineup, depending on offense versus defense with Josh Okogie, because they did it at the end of that Clippers game. And Reed downplayed it to me, and Jackson, him, he's very media trained. He's not going to say he can't do it, and all of these guys are confident. But to me, that's media speak. I think if you asked him off the record, he'd tell you that, yeah, it's a little bit more difficult to get in a rhythm. And I think the difference is what we saw late in the Denver game when he did close out and he hit those 2 big threes, including one with a minute left. This is the Denver game that they lost, the officiating steal last Monday. So when Reed is given a longer leash and he's not thinking about, is this his possession? Is this going to be Josh's possession? I think there's more potential there. It's not going to be seamless. It's, something of a risk defensively. But the other thing I keep coming back to, Jackson, they're getting crushed defensively anyway. Like, this is a team that is 15th in the NBA in December in defensive rating. They're 26th in the last 5 games. And I think for the season overall, like, Reed Sheppard's defensive rating is second or third best among individuals on the Rockets. Now, that's not me saying he's the second or third best defender. No, like, Ime Udoka is doing some creative things to scheme around it. But what that does tell you is that Ime Udoka is a good enough defensive coach to scheme around it. It's not like the team is getting run out of the gym defensively when Reed is out there. So because of that, if the Rockets are struggling this much in late game situations on offense, I'm inclined to sort of provide the Reed stimulus package and then trust that Ime can figure it out on the defensive end.
Is Reed Sheppard the answer for the Rockets' crunch time woes, or do they need to go out and find an external solution for these crunch time woes, as well as we'll get into some other final thoughts on what this team is currently dealing with. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Robinhood. Nobody knows your money goals better than you. Robinhood puts you in control of your money with tools that work as hard as you do, locking in on every opening, beating your PR, beating it again. Channel that drive into your money. Robinhood puts you in control of your money. Trade stocks and ETFs, options, futures, and crypto, all on one platform. You can now build and execute your own trades from a desktop with Robinhood Legends advanced tools, or take advantage of the new Robinhood strategies with a tailored portfolio managed by a team of experts. You expect more from yourself, expect more from your money. Get started today at Robinhood.com/yourmoney. Again, that's Robinhood.com/yourmoney. Your money, your move. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, Ben, we made a somewhat of a case there, right? And, I've been kind of beating this drum for a little bit, and as are many others, about just embracing what Reed Sheppard can and probably should be for this team this season, because he's the closest, I guess, analog that you get for Fred VanVleet, right? He's the one guy that has enough of the right skills to try and, fill that Fred VanVleet sized hole left due to the injury this season. Now, unfortunately, right, because of Ime Udoka's tendencies as a defense first head coach, we see him vacillating back and forth and trying to decide, okay, can he stomach? Does he have the pain tolerance for watching Reed Sheppard get picked on defensively and targeted, relentlessly when he's out there by certain teams and certain matchups and all of that? But I guess at this point, we're a little ways, past quarter of the way through this season. I feel like there's a couple different ways you can look at this, right? You can either just continue to maintain status quo, still plenty of time before the trade deadline gets here, before you ultimately have to make a call. But there's the internal route, right, of just hoping, hey, if you continue to give Reed these reps, if you continue to give Amen Thompson these reps, they will get better, they will get more comfortable, they will grow in their confidence, and they'll be able to hopefully down the line, once a playoff series gets here, actually execute and handle the late game pressures that come with being the primary ball handler, the primary initiator, all of that. And
one thing I'd like to quickly add, I would throw Tari Eason into the mix as well. It's not going to happen in the next week or two because he's limited on minutes coming off the month-long absence. But I think Tari has a little bit more potential than people realize to be, a finisher in those 4-on-3 scenarios and to do some things off the dribble. So in terms of evaluating the internal options, I agree with you that if Amen can't handle it, Reed is the most likely, next man up right now. But at some point before the trade deadline, maybe by this time a month from now, I'd like to explore Tari in that role a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as far as one of the final five guys finishing on the floor, right, you can see a world where if you have the right defensive pieces, you can have Kevin Durant and Alperen Sengun as your two offensive initiators. And if you just have the right role players around those guys, right, if you have Amen Thompson playing more like last season's Amen Thompson and then flanking those three guys, the Rockets' big three, if you will, you have a Tari Eason and then maybe a Jabari Smith Jr. or a Dorian Finney-Smith, guys who know their roles, who are going to be respected by the defense as legitimate floor spacers, to where you're not going to have the paint being crowded and clogged up when Alp or KD are going to make their their finishing move, if you will. And so those are certainly other options that they can explore. And I think we're talking about it from the standpoint of I think we can safely at this stage, unfortunately, rule out Amen Thompson as a true offensive initiator. He can be potentially the guy making the play out of those 4-on-3 scenarios in crunch time, sure, and he needs to be better at that. But unfortunately, given his limitations, you don't want him initiating the offense at the end of those games, right? So it's got to go through one of Kevin Durant or Alperen Sengun. But then the only other guy that you could run it through would be Reed Sheppard, right? Because Reed Sheppard can run a pick and roll. Reed Sheppard can run two-man game with either of the two Rocket stars. And then that frees up whichever star is not directly involved in the action to be playing off the ball, to be playing away from the play, and potentially be the recipient of some of those actions. And then Tari Eason is that other kind of, additional option that you could run out there. But then you get into the weed there where it's like, okay, how long can this team afford to stress test Amen Thompson and Reed Sheppard before they ultimately decide, are we content with these being our only options to try and make a deep postseason run this season? Are they banking on a Fred VanVleet return at the end of March? And that's why they're maybe like, you know what, it's fine. We'll coast, and then Fred will come back, and we don't care if we're the 5th or the 6th seed, right? We just want to have a puncher's chance in the playoffs. But you also then waste a year of whatever is left of Kevin Durant playing at this top 10, top 15 level. And that's problematic in its own right. So then you weigh the conversation. You come back to this point of, do the Rockets need to maybe make a trade to get an established guard and bring in a maybe not like an over the hill vet, but somebody that is more established, more confident, more comfortable, and can actually run the show the way that nobody else, frankly, can at this stage of the season. What are your thoughts on the Rockets actually maybe like swinging for a trade? I know they're limited in assets and what they could potentially sacrifice by way of a trade and bringing somebody in. But at this stage, it kind of feels like unless Ime embraces Reed and lets him start kind of taking those lumps and getting the necessary burn to kind of iron out the kinks defensively and work on his chemistry on offense and all that stuff, if he doesn't just lean into it sooner rather than later, then the Rockets are going to be in a rough spot down the line.
So I'll play devil's advocate on this because I hope a trade isn't necessary. And gun to my head, I don't think it will be. You're right that there's absolutely a world where it could be, where 6 weeks from now, we're having a very different conversation in early February, but I think there are enough potential outs. We mentioned trusting Reed Sheppard more. I'm curious what Tari does. Like, Tari's certainly not a traditional engine by any means, but I just bring him up because if you give Tari the ball where Amen caught it at the elbow as the release valve last night, I promise you, Tari Eason is not kicking that to Alperen Sengun 40 feet away. Tari Eason is attacking the rim for better or for worse, and sometimes that's what you need. So you can explore Reed and Tari as internal options for play finishers.
Or even Tari's on the other, on the other side of the floor where Josh Okogie, instead of Josh Okogie cutting in because Okogie is not a respected shooter, right? You have Tari Eason, a 50% 3-point shooter, flanking on the opposite wing, and then Amen Thompson makes that pass because it's blatant. It's like that's the right read.
Hilariously open. Yeah, it's Mario Ellie from 1995 open.
There you go.
So those could work. But you could also change your system. Like, as you said earlier, you don't have to run this KD as the decoy. This is a choice they are making. And to this point, it hasn't worked enough. Now, in time, maybe Amen develops. Maybe they trust Reed and Tari with more responsibilities and they can take on more. Or you could start trying some different things in those scenarios. You could run a little more Shin Hub and use Kevin more as an off-ball weapon. I feel like they got away from it because they did that a lot in the first game of the year at Oklahoma City, and it didn't go that well. But spoiler alert, most teams do not have Lou Dort as that defender that can keep Kevin from getting the ball and just single-handedly, face guard. Like, that's an outlier. I think you only have, 2 games left against OKC this year. So, I mean, maybe there's the argument that you need to have a system that's optimized for potentially beating OKC in the playoffs. But at least in the regular season, I think you can lean more into Şengün and trying to explore Kevin Durant off ball a little bit and not starting your possession with him 40 feet away and asking him to be 2019 James Harden, because KD is not nearly that level of ball handler, creator. He does have some turnover issues himself in terms of his court vision. So you can change up how you approach the system and not necessarily go for the decoy 4-on-3 approach. Rockets should have some practices when they get back to Houston. They're due for a ton of home games, so if nothing else, it will be a little bit easier to have practice time in their facility. I just think there's enough possibilities internally that I can't tell you which one is going to work out, but I'm optimistic that if you add them all up, I think it's better than 50-50, that they'll at least be in a better spot by the time the calendar rolls to February than they are right now. And if that's the case, I would be inclined to stay the course because they don't have a ton of assets. And me personally, I would rather keep the premium assets for a more impactful move as soon as next offseason. Like, if it looks that this formula just isn't working, then if you have those Phoenix picks, the Dallas pick in the war chest, the 2027 Brooklyn swap, all your young players, then you could conceivably be in the conversation for Giannis or any other big name that might hit the market next offseason. I'm not intrigued by pursuing Giannis at the trade deadline. I think that's way premature, but could the conversations be revisited next summer if this season doesn't play out as we think and maybe we're not as optimistic about the totality of this young core? Yeah, like, I don't see how you can rule it out, especially with Kevin Durant, as you mentioned, still at the peak of his power. So I would rather, if there is improvement, I would rather keep my premium assets for the offseason, preserve the optionality, if you will, if you are seeing signs of positive growth. I can't tell you for sure that's going to happen, but there are enough possibilities, especially if the coaching staff, loosens their approach a little bit, be it with players or playing style, that I can't help but think that at least one of them is going to hit.
And look, at the end of the day, and we've kind of alluded to this as we've brought up, different names throughout the show. We didn't get to it. We didn't mention him yet, but Steven Adams is another guy who's been out there in some of these crunch time lineups and possessions. And ultimately the Rockets do not have a certified like 5-man lineup that doesn't have a glaring flaw or weakness in it. And that's part of the big problem here, right? Is any one of the they've got they're penciled in for, right? With KD, Şengün, Amen, and Jabari. And then whoever that fifth is, there's shortcomings there. If it's Josh Okogie, then it's okay, what is he not giving you offensively, but he's giving you the defense stuff? If it's Reed Sheppard, okay, he's being targeted defensively. He's young, he's inexperienced, but he gives you a higher ceiling on offense. If it's Steven Adams, he does all the different Steven Adams-y things that he does in the game, the screening, the rebounding, the second chance opportunities, but he also kind of mucks up the Rockets spacing. And then you have multiple non-shooters on the floor. And then it's like, okay, well, then you don't have any space for your stars to actually operate. Yeah. And then it gets messy that way. And so there isn't a one size fits all answer yet. I'm inclined to believe that Dorian Finney-Smith actually gets close to being that one size fits all answer. Or maybe
we haven't talked about him enough
Eason
in this episode. He could potentially fill some of these gaps as well. But I also think
he's a Josh Okogie that can consistently shoot is the thing.
And way more length. Yeah. So it's easier for him to finish if he dives to the rim. Mm-hmm. I also think a big variable is going to be Alperen Sengun's defense. Like Steven Adams' stats on Twitter posted the lineup data the other night that the Şengün only lineups have not been holding up well, with Şengün as the only big that is defensively. And that's been a big part of their downturn this month. And they've had to use Steven Adams as the floor raiser for the defense. And I think because of that, it does present some complications offensively, as you said. Like, I hate the criticism that Şengün's gotten about, shooting too much in the clutch and his efficiency being down, because I think a lot of the bad numbers for Şengün in the clutch are because the rest of the team just doesn't have a plan. Like the end of the New Orleans game, whose defender is coming over to help on Şengün when he's trying to win it at the buzzer? It's Steven Adams, because you're not able to space the floor. That defender is close to the rim anyway. And so when Şengün drives to the rim, it was actually a fascinating juxtaposition. So when Şengün hit what should have been the game winner in Denver, it was Reed Sheppard and not Steven Adams. And you know what happened? Alpi got to attack in single coverage. So the floor was spaced. KD drew the second defender. He drew a little bit of help. And Şengün just went and cooked. In New Orleans, because it was Steven Adams out there and not Reed Sheppard, the Steven defender comes over, and the shot for Alpi is just basically impossible, shooting over two big men at an awkward angle as time expires. And then in Sacramento, a couple of nights later, the grenade, let's just be blunt. If Amen Thompson kicks it to you 40 feet from the basket with 4 seconds left on the shot clock, that's basically a grenade. What the hell is Alperen Sengun going to be able to do there? Like, offensively, I do think the clutch data being down on Alperen Sengun is a little misleading, because I think the reasons he's been inefficient are structural. However, I do think the defensive struggles, and it's not just Alpi, really across the board, I don't think a lot of players are performing as well as we would like them to play defensively. Quite frankly, I don't think Amen Thompson has been as good this year defensively as he has been last year. He's been as good in spurts, but not overall.
And just throwing in a note on the defensive thing, right back to what we talked about with kind of the culture and identity crisis, is it doesn't feel like this team is as fired up, as motivated, kind of, putting a bow on the conversation, circling back, and you're missing a guy like your Dillon Brooks, right? The guy that was in charge of being, even though Dillon Brooks wasn't the team's best defender by any stretch of the imagination because of how good Amen Thompson was last year, right? But Dillon was the guy that fired everybody up. He got guys motivated. He got guys excited and bought into play defense. You're missing Fred VanVleet's voice out there, right? Fred VanVleet, a very demonstrative, very, he was the leader. He was the quarterback for the team on both sides of the floor. Yeah. And so you're missing those voices that helped cultivate this defensive culture and the identity of this team. And now you're not maybe rudderless without them, but you are missing them severely. And Kevin said it himself, right? He's more of that quiet leader, right? Yeah. And we saw him being demonstrative against the Nuggets. And maybe that's the version of Kevin Durant the Rockets need every night to be able to be fired up. Troll God KD unlocks this Rockets team. There you go.
But I also think across the board, the intensity was higher. Maybe it's because of KD is troll God, but I thought Şengün specifically that game was much better defensively. I thought, he didn't score a lot that game because so many other guys had it going on that night, but defensively, that was the Alperen Sengun that we saw the last 2 years when he made big strides on the defensive end of the court. And that was a really strong performance. Held the Nuggets to 66 points through 3 quarters, their lowest scoring game of the season. But that's going to be critical moving forward, because I agree with you. Like, Steven Adams does put a cap. If you need to have him out there to raise the floor for your defense, that it is going to muck it up spacing wise a little bit, especially in high leverage spots. So you need those Alperen Sengun only lineups, as far as him being the only true big man out there, to be able to hold up defensively for these ideas we're talking about offensively to take off. Like, Reed Sheppard is obviously the bigger question, because at 21 years old, being undersized, like, how much do you give up defensively when you play Reed? Like, that's the big question when it comes to running more through Reed, especially in high leverage situations where the other team's going to be playing their best players and they're going to be trying to target Reed every chance they get. But also, how does Şengün fare as the only big? If he can hold up the way he did against Denver, I think that's going to give Ime Udoka way more optionality for what he can do with those closing lineups.
Absolutely. Fully agree there. We want your thoughts, though, on some fixes, some things you like to see differently for the Rockets, kind of handling some of these crunch time woes that we've spent this entire episode talking about. Give us your thoughts in the YouTube comments. Ben, you know the drill. Let everyone know where to track you down at.
Yep. Ben DuBose on Twitter and Blue Sky, where you see me dropping lots of curse words during Rockets games these days. And, of course, for non-cursing coverage, you can read my work at USA Today's Rockets Wire and at Clutch Fans.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thanks so much for checking out the show. Remember, the best way to help us grow the show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.